you ever taken a photo where you wanted everything in focus but you couldn't get it in focus? Or you wanted to blur out something because it was distracting and yet it comes out in your photo nice and sharp and distracting? Well, here's how we go about doing that, controlling the depth of field, and that's what we'll look at in this video. Hi, Peter Charles here of Hooked for Life Photography, and today we're going to look at depth of field. So what is exactly depth of field and what does it mean? Well, it's how much of the image is in focus, how deep our focus extends. So example, we have a subject, we have something in front of it, something behind it. So deep depth of field, all three elements would be in focus. A shallow depth of field, only the subject would be in focus. The foreground and the background would be out of focus. So it's how deep the focus is in our image, how far back it extends. And we can have very shallow depth of field where, that much is in focus, or we can go from here to infinity, it'll be in focus. So it is quite an interesting concept, and it has lots of applications in our creative process. So let's get into depth of field. We're going to look at three aspects of it that control depth of field, and we're going to look at two things to consider beyond that. So first off, we're going to look at the screen here, and in that red ellipse is the distance scale of our camera. Now, in the old days when we have film lenses, we would have the distance scale on the lens. Today, it's normally in our viewfinder. We don't see it on the lens anymore. And if you don't see the distance scale in your viewfinder or on your screen, check in your menu to turn it on, because usually you can turn these things on or off. And you can see in this particular example, we have that little sliding bar. It's got a blue section and a white middle. That little bar is indicates where your focus is. In this case, it's around 2 meters. And the blue part of it is how much of it is in focus. So I'm just going right down to 1 meter, and you can see the blue bar is very narrow at 1 meter. So when you're looking in your viewfinder and seeing the size of that bar decreasing or increasing, you have an idea how deep your depth of field is. And it's a good thing to have turned on in your camera if you really want to make use of depth of field. Now, there's a couple of other things to think about, because there's different ways to view depth of field. Now, physically, it's the same thing. There's no change to the camera, there's no change to the lens. It's the change in our perception. And the depth of field scale on a Fujifilm camera can be changed. We can put it to pixel basis or film format basis. Now, I don't play around with enough other cameras to know if this capability is in a lot of cameras, something worth checking out. But pixel basis depth of field is a very, very precise depth of field that looks at the pixel sharpness coming off the sensor, and it would be critical for commercial photographers or people who are printing very large images, that sort of thing. But for the vast majority of us, it's not that particularly useful, because the human perception of sharpness is not as intolerant as the pixel basis. We have a wider acceptance of sharpness. And that's where the film format basis comes in. It refers to the depth of field we would normally find on an old film lens. So it's worth turning that on if you have that capability. And what it gives you is essentially the depth of field scale that we would have seen on an old film lens like this one. That is a more practical thing, because for the average person using a modern digital camera, you're putting it online, you're sending it to friends, you may be making small prints. If you belong to a club, you might be tossing it into a competition. All the different things that enthusiasts do with their images, and very few of them require that precision of pixel basis for depth of field. So if you have the ability in your camera to turn it on to film format, do it. It makes it a much more practical tool. So here's an example of what that looks like in terms of the difference between pixel basis and film format basis. Pixel basis is on the top, film format on the bottom. Here we have our film format has gone all the way to infinity. So right now, everything from about 4 meters out to infinity is in focus in terms of the film format, but only around, what, 7 to 10 meters is in focus according to the pixel basis. I find the film format is much more useful. And keep in mind, there's no physical change to the camera or the lens. This is perception, not some kind of mechanical change to the way the lens is working. So putting it to film format is not changing the quality of the image at all. It's about our perception of sharpness. So let's talk a moment about the creative use of depth of field, and then we'll get on to some of the other aspects of how we control it. I'm going to put up 6 photos done in different ways for different objectives, and you can see how depth of field works in all these cases. Now the first one, this model had this very shiny bracelet. I didn't want that sharp because it's too distracting. I wanted the focus on her face and her eyes. I kept the depth of field shallow, so it's just her face and eyes that are in focus. Here's a similar situation, except it's a piano and a window behind the model. I didn't want those sharp because, again, they're distracting. I wanted the focus on her face, and then again, so shallow depth of field, it gave me her face and her arm in the front of the image. In this case, the model was standing in front of a very distracting, very busy wall. So again, a shallow depth of field allowed me to blur out that wall, and it was no longer going to be bothersome. And if I had had a deep depth of field, the picture would have been dominated by that ugly wall that was behind her. Now here I'm on vacation, and it's the opposite. I want as much of the photo in focus as I possibly can get. And I was using a small point and shoot camera, which made that job easier. And I'll explain that a little later on, why it made it easier. But I mean, in this image, everything from the front of the boat to that cable in the back, or that rope in the back, that's all in focus. And here's another one where I want the small boat at the beginning, at the front of the image, and the large boats at the back. I wanted them all in focus. Even the breakwater work like a charm. And here's the most dramatic image about depth of field. From that fence at the foreground to that mountain in the background, all of it's in focus. So for a vacation shot, you can't ask for better. I mean, you're getting everything in focus. If that fence had been out of focus, it would have been distracting, and I probably would have deleted that image. So you can see the difference in between these sets of photos. One, I'm using shallow depth of field to concentrate the viewer's attention on the model and remove any distracting elements in the background. In the vacation photos, I want everything sharp because we want to be able to see all elements in the photo. So let's look at actually controlling our depth of field and what we need to do. And in this case, we're going to look at the role aperture plays on depth of field. And remember, aperture is the hole in the lens, and you can have it very big or you can have it very small. And so you can control aperture in pretty well every camera out there that is beyond a plastic thing. Okay, here's my depth of field. I'm starting off at f2, which is the maximum aperture for that lens, the biggest opening. And we'll just decrease the aperture, I should say, and see how the depth of field is increasing. That blue bar is getting bigger and bigger as the aperture gets smaller and smaller. So here I am at f16, and everything from 1.5 meters to 3 meters is in focus, but at f2, there's only a few centimeters that are in focus, about 6 inches, maybe less than that. So there's a difference between using a large aperture, which gives you shallow depth of field, or a very small aperture, which gives you a very deep depth of field. And so when you were looking at those pictures that I was showing you earlier, the models were shot with a large aperture, I should say, and the vacation pictures were shot with a small aperture. And that gave me the depth of field or the shallowness that I wanted. So what does the impact of the focal length have on depth of field, the focal length of the lens? Now you may have run into this already. You use a wide angle lens, everything seems to be sharp and in focus, and use a telephoto lens that allows you to see far away and see a small area far away. The depth of field seems quite shallow. So let's look at that in actual practice. This is the privacy screen that goes around my patio. I thought it'd be a good example because it's got those nice vertical bars and allows us to see what's in focus. So here I'm using an 18mm lens at f8, And you can see most of that image is in focus. The front post is a little out, and the tree is a little out, but it's pretty well, virtually the whole thing is in focus. Now, when I go to a 60mm focal length, I've just zoomed in a bit because my camera is on a tripod. I'm not moving the camera. I'm not changing the aperture. It's still at f8. All I'm doing is zooming. And now we can see the middle bars are in focus, but the bars close to me and far away from me, they're out of focus. So that's a relatively shallow depth of field at 60mm. And then now we're going to go to 120mm, and you can see just that one bar is in focus. All the other bars are out of focus. So that depth of field went from pretty well the entire screen going back to a tree when I was using an 18mm, and when I went to 120mm, it went down to one bar. And that gives you an idea that as you widen the view or zoom in, your depth of field is going to change. So here I put it to f22 on the 18 and the 120, and you can see it for the 18mm at f22, everything is sharp, all the way back to that tree. But at 120mm, maybe 3 pars are sharp and the rest are not. So even when you go to f22, you're not gaining a lot of sharpness in terms of your depth of field. Your depth of field is not getting all that deep with telephoto lenses. But keep in mind, I was using the same aperture for all of these shots, and my camera was on the tripod and it wasn't moving. So I'm shooting from the same position for all of the shots. So how does distance affect? In other words, how far away from the subject are we? If we're close to the subject, does that have a difference compared to being far away? So let's take a look at that. So I've got my bar here that shows how much depth of field I've got. I'm at f11, and I'm at 2.7 meters, and I've got a lot of depth of field here. But as I get closer to the subject, my depth of field is getting skinnier. And you can see there's almost no depth of field when I get down close to half a meter. So there's the difference between 0.6 of a meter and out to infinity. At infinity, I've got everything from 4 meters to infinity at f11, but when I'm down about 0.6 of a meter, I've got about that much. So how far you are from your subject will dictate how much depth of field you have. So when I was talking about that telephoto lens, if I'd been much further away from that screen with the telephoto lens, I would have had much more of it in focus. So does magnification play a role? Yeah. What I was just talking about, your distance, you put your distance together with the focal length. There are a yin and a yang going on here. There's a linkage between the distance and the focal length. And it gets interesting. So here I'm using the 18mm at f16. And what I'm doing with these shots is I'm trying to keep the image the same size, particularly the 3 white Lego men in the middle of that image. I'm trying to keep them the same size, the same magnification, and I'm just moving the camera backwards or forwards to keep that magnification the same. So I changed lenses. I use an 18, 35, and a 56. So here's the 35 at f16, and doesn't that look the same? Like, go back to, let's see, go back to the 18. Now, the red fellow at the beginning, the front of the picture is bigger because of the perspective difference of an 18mm. But is he any sharper than that guy? Not really. So let's see what happens when I go out to a 56mm lens. Does it look any different? No. The depth of field is pretty well the same. Perspective has changed. With the 56, it gets flattened. And, the little men look almost all the same size. There's not much difference between the guy at the front and the guy at the back. But, the depth of field of all 3 images, basically the same. So there we are. There's the little red guy at the beginning. Of course, he's bigger in the 18mm because of the perspective difference. But the relative sharpness from the guy with the lightsaber all the way through to the red guy is the same. One's done with an 18 and one's done with a 56, both shot at f16. So you're saying to yourself that 56mm lens should, by rights, have a lot shallower depth of field. but when I kept the magnification the same, the depth of field was the same. And so what that means for us when we're out taking photos, this was at Upper Canada Village, and this was our school teacher. I took a photo of her with a short telephoto lens. So if I had moved closer and used a standard lens like the 35mm here and framed it exactly the same, so I included the same elements in the picture, exactly the same framing, I would have had the same depth of field at f4, which is what this one was shot at. So let's keep that in mind when you're out there taking pictures and you change lenses, thinking you're going to get more depth of field at that same aperture. If you move closer because you've now put on a wider angle lens, you're bringing your depth of field back to where it was with the previous lens. So magnification is the yin and yang with distance. As you get closer to an image, your depth of field shrinks, but if you go from a wide angle to a telephoto, you can move back to get the same magnification. Now you're back to the same depth of field. So you've got the yin and yang going between magnification, the focal length of the lens, and the distance you're working at. So keep that in mind. It's not an automatic. When you just put on a wide angle lens, you're going to get automatically an increased depth of field, because if you move forward to fill the frame, you're reducing your depth of field with that wide angle lens. So that's an interesting point that doesn't get brought up very often in these discussions of depth of field, that it's critical to also consider the working distance and the magnification that you're using. Now, the last thing is sensor size. So does sensor size play a role in the depth of field? Well, indirectly it does. When you go to a smaller sensor, you have to go to a shorter focal length to get the same image. So I can shoot, as we'll see in this examples, I can shoot with a small sensor, a medium-sized sensor, a larger sensor, and I have to go up in focal length of lens to get the same image, the same magnification, the same framing. So this first image is shot with a 1/2-inch sensor camera, and it's 18mm at f6 1.3 for this picture. And the equivalent focal length in 35mm terms is about 100mm. And you can see, so you've got a 1/2-inch sensor, an 18mm lens is the same as a 100mm lens on a full frame camera in terms of its angle of view, what it sees. So its depth of field is quite good. Now I'm jumping up to a 1-inch sensor, and I'm using a 37mm lens at 6.3, which gives me the same 100mm equivalent. And now you're seeing that the guys at the front and the back are going out of focus. My depth of field is shrinking because I've gone up to a 37mm to keep things the same. You know, I've gone to a bigger sensor, I have to go to a longer lens, shallower depth of field. Now we're going to go up to an even bigger sensor, which is the APS-C, and again, I'm using 64mm now at 6.4. It's again a 100mm equivalent, and look, it's just the 3 guys in the middle plus the blue guy that's in focus. Everything else is out of focus. So when you're using a small sensor camera, you're using a shorter focal length lens to get the same image as a bigger sensor camera with a longer lens. And that has the impact on your depth of field. So by using a small sensor camera, you get a greater depth of field simply because you're using a shorter focal length of lens to do the job. So it's the focal length of the lens that counts, not the sensor size. And so if you're using an 18mm lens, and you've seen other 18mm shots in this video, they're wide angle on a APS-C camera, and they're telephoto lens on a 1/2-inch sensor. So that's basically the difference there. It's the lens, not the sensor. You look at the focal length of the lens, and that's going to give you an idea of your depth of field. So there's the recap of this section. The small sensor has an 18mm lens, so the depth of field is deep. The larger 1-inch sensor has a 37mm lens, so the depth of field is shallower than compared to the 18.5-inch. The APS-C has the longest focal length of 64 millimeters and the shallowest depth of field, and these are all 100 millimeter equivalent lenses. So you're getting the same image. You're seeing the same image. Those images are uncropped that I showed you of the Lego men. They're all the same image, same magnification, same framing. And by going to a larger sensor, we're getting shallower depth of field because the focal length of the lens is longer. And it's to do with the coverage of the lens. When you have a small sensor, you can have small coverage from the lens. When you have a big sensor, you need big coverage from the lens. And that's the reason why we get this difference. So to wrap this up, depth of field is determined by the focal length of the lens, the aperture, whether it's big or it's small, and how far away you are from the subject. And the other impacts we have on a depth of field is the magnification or the framing. You can look at it either way, how you frame the shot or the magnification of the shot, and the sensor size. So while they don't control depth of field, you have to think about them because they do influence the depth of field in your images. So the bottom line here is to be able to control the depth of field enables us to make creative choices with our photography. Whether we want very little in focus or a great deal in focus is dependent on what we want the image to look like. So knowing how to manage our depth of field becomes essential to creative photography. So keep that in mind. When you're going out, just don't sit there, plant your feet, zoom, and take a picture. Think about all these issues and what kind of depth of field you want in that image, then adjust the camera to make it work. So keep all that in mind. Cheers.